Hey, deserving listeners. Today's episode is Chapter 2 in my deep dive on schizoid personality disorder. I thought I would start with another fictionalized case of schizoid. This is someone that could show up in my office. Let's start off by saying that this person is a woman. She's currently 35 years old. She lives alone. And she works from home. She translates technical manuals as a contract worker, so she doesn't have to interact with people very much. Growing up in the past, her parents went through a very nasty divorce that lasted for several years. Eventually, the courts had to intervene, and they decided to split custody between both of the parents. So for the first 7 years of Emma's young life, she went through a lot of difficulty and chaos and conflict. At school, she kept to herself because she didn't really understand other kids and she didn't really get along with them. Also at school, teachers often would complain that she was, quote, in her own world and very distractible. And they recommended that Emma be evaluated, and she was evaluated, and she was diagnosed with ADHD, and she was put on ADHD medications for a couple years. The meds seemed to help a little bit, but there were complications with the meds, so her parents took her off the meds after a couple years. Other kids tended to avoid her at school, possibly because Emma seemed to be aloof or stuck up or in her own world, or weird was another word that they would describe her as. And Emma wasn't particularly interested in the things that other girls were interested in anyway, so Emma didn't seem to care that the other kids ignored her. She did well in school, but if the assignment required interacting with others, then she would either barely participate in the activity or she would act like she was sick so she could stay home. At home and at school, she would occasionally have angry outbursts, which prompted her parents to seek professional help. They brought her to a clinician who specialized in assessing and treating children. The clinician diagnosed her with Asperger's, which is the term that they used back then. Today, we would say the individual was on the autism spectrum. And the family and Emma completely agreed with this diagnosis of autism. This diagnosis really helped them to understand why Emma seemed so different from others. And it was a big relief to know that there was something different about her because she acted so differently. And Emma as well felt some relief, some hope. So she was also diagnosed with bipolar by the clinician, and she was put on mood stabilizers, which seemed to help with her angry outbursts. And the family also had hope regarding that, and the school seemed satisfied as well. So because she was diagnosed on the autism spectrum, the school put her with a group of other kids who were also on the autism spectrum. At first, things seemed to be going really well, but over time, Emma noticed that she never really felt like she was similar to the other kids in the group. They shared some similarities, but she didn't feel like she fit in, whereas the other kids in the group felt a part of the group and she didn't. And this added to her sense of feeling very different from other people, maybe even from the human race altogether. And this also added to her ongoing sense of isolation that she had been feeling since she was born. She didn't tell anyone about this because she was used to being very self-sufficient by then, so it didn't even necessarily occur to her to tell anyone what was going on. Plus, she didn't really think anyone would care anyway, because that was generally how she was being treated at home and at school. Currently, as an adult, years later, at the age of 35, she only socializes with her family. Although she is a little removed from her family, she does have closeness with them and is mutually supportive. So, chiming in here a bit, it's a it's a false notion that people with schizoid never have close relationships. They tend not to, but they can have some limited closeness with some limited individuals, maybe someone that they trust in their family. So with Emma's family, she did like to engage in small gatherings, but she hated large gatherings like weddings and stuff. And she hated events that would require her to perform somehow in front of other people. So she would avoid that always, and the family knew that about her. She did annoy her family members sometimes with her superior attitude. She came across as being holier than thou or a know-it-all, but the family just swept it under the rug like they usually did. And they observed that she can be sometimes very blunt in a hurtful way. Like one time at Thanksgiving dinner, she told her mom that she looked like she had gained weight, and everyone at the table went silent. Her mom started crying a little bit, and she left the table. And Emma was confused by this because it did indeed look like her mom had gained weight, so she didn't understand what all the fuss was about. And because the family believed that she was on the autism spectrum, her family just attributed this behavior to that. But the family is still very concerned that Emma doesn't have any friends. They worried that she rarely left her apartment, and they were worried that she didn't have very good hygiene, like she seemingly didn't shower very often, and she would wear the same clothes for several days, seemingly. And the mom would sometimes pressure her to date by going on Tinder or trying to set her up with people. But Emma would quickly shut that down because she would express just that would just never happen, or she wasn't ready or something. Over time, Emma started to believe that she was asexual and aromantic. Those labels felt very comfortable to her. She was always really into Star Trek. She loved Star Trek, particularly the character of Data, the android. She really loved how smart and capable he was, and she liked that he didn't have any emotion, and he didn't seem to understand emotion because she felt very much like Data. He also was separate from the human race, but in a superior way, which she also felt for herself. But he did want a place with humans. He did want to understand emotions. He did want to have emotions. And sometimes she did notice that she felt that way, but she would quickly sweep that under the rug. She currently spends a lot of time on Reddit talking with others about the vast Star Trek universe, not only just Data, but all the various different characters. Online, she sometimes came across to others as being arrogant and a know-it-all, like she was looking down on others. Whenever she had free time, she spent almost all of that time writing fan fiction about Data and Star Trek. Whenever she is bored currently, her mind will quickly focus on her internal stories about Data and Star Trek. She imagines all sorts of things, all sorts of missions that he might go on, and she imagines that she herself, Emma herself, is in these stories. That's part of the fan fiction. And she works very closely with Data. She doesn't have a romantic involvement with Data, but she considers Data to be like her, and she considers Data to be a friend. And in these stories, these very elaborate stories that she's been writing for several years, maybe decades since she was a teen or younger, in these stories, her and Data go on missions together, and she will write these stories and share them online. But people online often complain that they don't really understand the plot of her stories, so she mainly keeps her stories to herself. Inside of herself, Emma feels like she is separate from the rest of humans, although she does really love cats and dogs and other animals, but she claims she really hates humans. Sometimes she feels a lot of emotion, like when she was a kid and she would have angry outbursts. She didn't really know what the emotions were. She had a bit of a story about it, like that it had to do with not keeping her body in check and not monitoring the things that she did all day long. But she didn't really understand where these emotions came from. She didn't even really understand what the emotions were called. They were a very confusing mix to her of anger and sadness and despair. And she would engage in a lot of measures to try to manage the triggering of these emotions, which mainly meant staying home and not really interacting with other people. And she really hated these emotional outbursts. And to cope with it, when it did happen, she would isolate herself if she wasn't already isolated, and she would smoke excessive amounts of marijuana. She watches a lot of YouTube videos about various things. She sometimes watches videos about sociopathy or introversion because she wonders if she is a sociopath or perhaps introverted. She shows the most empathy toward her cat and her plants. She is a very good caregiver to her cat and her plants, which warms the heart of her parents. She talks to them often. She talks to the cat and plants often, and they feel very safe to her as other entities to have a relationship with, because these other entities are very predictable. The cat acts very similarly from time, throughout the day, and the plants are very predictable. And the plants and the cat, they aren't very complicated, and they don't really ask for much. And she really enjoys that relationship. She has a very rich relationship with her cat, particularly, and also her plants. Very talkative relationship, very involved relationship. And she often secretly wonders, what's the point of living? I don't know. Why are we here? Not that she's thinking about existential philosophy, but fundamentally, she just doesn't really understand why anyone would care about being alive. She wasn't suicidal. She wasn't depressed, but she just didn't really understand the point in life. It just felt like this activity that people did because they felt like they had to, and she understood that that was the case, and so she really questioned what the point of it all was. Other people seem to have goals and other kinds of enjoyments in life, but she would contend that life is meaningless and everyone else is just living a lie. At least she knows that life is pointless. Whenever she goes to the store, she wears big Bluetooth headphones because she loves listening to music, but also she wants to send a message to others that she's not interested in interacting with others. All right, end of profile. So this is just one presentation of schizoid. It's not necessarily a typical case, but there are elements of this story that many people with schizoid would be able to identify with. Now, the way that I described the case of Emma, it's hard to know if this person actually suffers from schizoid, because the way that I depicted the case of Emma, she doesn't go into therapy and doesn't explore what's going on with her the way that Josh did. The Josh case story that I said, he went to therapy and was able to explore and figure out what was going on with him. With Emma, she is still, at the age of 35, in a very ignorant place. She doesn't know what's going on with her, and she doesn't have any insight into what's happening. And she has concluded that she probably is on the autism spectrum, and that she's asexual, and that she's aromantic, and that she's superior in that she understands that life is meaningless and everyone is living a lie. If she were to engage in therapy with a specialist in this and were to work meaningfully in therapy for at least a couple years, she would probably, given that I'm in my story, she doesn't actually have autism. She actually suffers from schizoid, and she's not aromantic and she's not asexual. She actually does deep down want romantic relationships and does have the capacity for a sex drive, but it's so buried underneath her defensive structure that she doesn't have access to it or chooses to ignore it. So for her, in my story, she, with some therapy and insight, would discover that she does indeed want closeness and intimacy, but early in life, while her parents were going through a very chaotic and conflictual divorce, she felt neglected and ignored and treated like a pawn in their divorce. She felt like she was just another object, like the way that the parents during the divorce fought over the house or the car or inheritance. They also fought about Emma, and Emma felt like she was just some line item on the court documents that needed to be divvied up between two very angry and neglectful parents. And so she doesn't really understand that. She remembers it sort of, but she doesn't really make the connection between those early experiences and the fact that she prefers to be very alone. So that's the way I would describe Emma. And there are many other presentations of schizoid, some of which involve someone who on the surface seems very social and very connected, but underneath it all, they are not. So maybe next time I'll tell a story of what people will sometimes call a secret schizoid. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. In this chapter, I'm going to be going over the symptoms mainly, which is a very involved lecture because that's how I operate. I don't just read the DSM criteria because it's much more complicated than that, and it can be organized in a more sensible way to me. So if you want to hear that, you have to become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. When you become a patron of Psychology in Seattle, you get access to this chapter along with all the other full chapters of the Schizoid Deep Dive and the full episodes of hundreds of episodes that are probably our best episodes and other deep dives on personality disorders. So do that now if you want. Otherwise, take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.